Hey guys, welcome back to OrmsTV, and today we are checking probably some of the best-selling mirrorless cameras from Canon range at the moment, the brand new R3, R5, and also the R6.
Yeah, and what we decided to do, instead of diving into the specs of these things and telling you all the nitty-gritty, which you can go and read the spec sheets, we decided to put these cameras through some specific use cases where you'd actually use these things. So we were looking at how they perform when you're shooting portraits, when you're shooting in low light, when you're shooting some fast moving action, when you're shooting bursts and you're tracking and you're shooting video on these units, how the IBIS performs. And that's really what we want to get to here, because these cameras, while being very similar, they are very, very different and aimed at very different target audiences. So testing them out, seeing which one is best for which type of photography you might be leaning into, and taking you guys along for the ride.
Now first up, we need to give a big shout out to the guys from Specialized for hooking us up on the day, allowing us to shoot in their building and also around the building, and also on the brand new Specialized pump track that's out on the Blauwklippen wine estate. Definitely go check it out if you're into mountain biking. Now that gave us a great opportunity to test the speed of these cameras, but also we shot some nice portraits, and we had a great opportunity of testing some low light shots in the warehouse as well.
Now, since you mentioned the mountain biking and the speed of these cameras, good enough place to start, right? So let's talk about the burst speed and the tracking potential within these cameras.
Yeah, so quite important, we updated firmware on all these models. It's something I always recommend to my clients because Canon is constantly improving the software on these cameras that's driving the autofocus. However, so when you talk about specs, it's very easy. 12 mechanical on the R6 and the R5 and 20 in the electronic mode. However, the R3 obviously being way faster, 12 mechanical and 30 frames per second in electronic mode.
Now, in terms of the burst shooting on these cameras, personally, I found it actually very similar shooting between them. I can't really tell the difference between 30 frames a second and 20 frames a second. 20 frames a second is already stupidly fast, and 30 being just a little bit faster. When I'm shooting, I can't really pick that up. Yes, reviewing the images in post, absolutely, you can tell the difference. But to me, if I was somebody who needs that type of speed shooting, if I'm an amateur wildlife photographer or amateur sports photographer, I would be very, very happy going either at the R6 or the R5, if I could go there, and utilizing that 20 frames a second. I think that's pretty solid performance.
Yeah, there's almost very little that you can see through the viewfinder, especially between 20 and 30 frames. The R3 with the 30 frames is just going to ensure you that you get that sort of perfect moment when you do capture like birds maybe flying at high speed or mountain biking going downhill at high speed.
Absolutely.
On the day though, we did see quite a big difference with the tracking capabilities. You and myself, we shot at various different periods, and the R3 for sure was way better with tracking skulk, especially when he was coming down and up the berms and hitting some of those jumps. You could definitely see the R3 was holding the focus on him way faster.
Yes, and that really surprised me. So I've shot extensively with the R6, but not all that much with the R5 in the past. And it always felt to me like the R6 was fast and it locks on and it's right there and you don't have to wait for anything. And shooting these cameras in isolation, the autofocus is spectacular. The eye tracking, the animal autofocus, all of those things work phenomenally well. But shooting them side by side, I'm going to 100% echo what you said. And it's weird because in theory, the autofocus system is the same throughout these cameras. But the R3 is leagues ahead. There was a section where I was sort of standing on a little rise on the pump track, and Skulk was coming straight towards me. And the R6 and R5 would pick up his face and then lock to his eye. Sort of, he was kind of like almost halfway down the track already. The R3 though, like I could barely see him, and the R3 picks up, locks onto his eye and locks in, and it just stays there throughout. And that's huge. If you are into your sport or your wildlife and you need that little bit of extra performance, and it feels like a little bit when you're shooting them separately, side by side, it's big. But it's a little bit of an improvement, but it makes a massive, massive difference. And that puts the R3 in a completely league of its own when it comes to the autofocus tracking capabilities.
Now, next up, we shot a portrait sequence. It was of Skulk when he was getting ready before the pump track mission, and that was outside. We also have a couple of sequences of one of the specialized technicians working on a mountain bike inside of the shop. Now, first up, I mean, the R5 is 45 megapixel. So out of the box, you would kind of probably point towards the R5 more because it's capturing way more detail. R3 is sitting at 24 and the R6 is at 20 megapixels. Now, looking at some of these images, we can see that obviously, like I said, the R5 is going to be sharper. It is going to capture way more detail. So that is going to be probably your winner for landscapes and portraits.
Yeah, fully agree with that. I mean, there's no two ways around it. Your R3, really good as well, like really, really solid. And the R6, really not bad. Again, if you're shooting these in isolation, you're going to be hard pressed to really pick up a difference between these cameras. And just also to mention, while we are calling this a portrait section, maybe think of it more as like a working photographer section, you know, because when you're talking about portraits, you know, you could be going anywhere from studio shooting to shooting weddings, shooting ad campaigns, shooting fashion, anything like that, where that sort of performance is important. And yes, to my eyes, the R3, R5, clear victor, no two ways around it. I would say the R3 a close second, unless you're really punching in, unless you're doing that 100% crop. But if you're just looking at them straight up, R3 close second. R6 unfortunately does fall a little bit behind, but again, really solid performance actually.
Yeah, I think in today's technology, we are kind of spoiled with megapixel. And I mean, back in the day, 20 megapixel was sort of the biggest number out there.
Yeah.
So it's still big enough to go print your A1 or A0 prints. There's nothing wrong with 20 megapixel. But having 45, you just have more, double
Exactly.
the detail. Yeah.
Exactly. There is just no two ways around it.
Yeah.
More resolution gives you a cleaner image in these cases. Now, if we look at the shots that were taken inside the specialized workshop, also in the same portrait section, I think that in some of those scenarios, it almost feels like the R3 and the R6 came out a little bit better to me. Like, I kind of like the colors that came out, specifically out of the R3. I really enjoy the contrast that was generated in those, and the images performed really well in that slightly dimmer lit environment. I really kind of enjoyed that.
Yeah, I think that's probably to do with the lower megapixel count being a little bit better in terms of low light. That's going to help your camera especially. Yeah.
Okay, now going a little bit further into the low light performance of these cameras, we were also shooting inside the specialized workshop and shooting a technician busy servicing
a shock.
A shock, yeah. Okay, cool. Obviously, I'm not a mountain biker. As you can see. And in that scenario, the differences between these cameras and their low light performance stood out a little bit more to me. Now, I was shooting quite a bit on the R5 in that scenario, and I kind of struggled. And this was sort of like the darkest area that we were shooting in. And I found myself struggling a little bit with the R5, to nail focus, and then to get a clean image out of it. And I know that there's some differences here, but I just found the R3 and the R6 performing better in that low light scenario for me personally, how I generally shoot.
Yeah, so it comes back to the fact that the R5, because of the higher megapixel count, it's not going to be the greatest low light solution. And if you look at the R6 and the R3's expanded ISO, it's actually doubled than the R5. So you can push these two models in low light way more than you can with the R5, and that's kind of what we saw in the shots. Now, next up, we're going to talk about IBIS, which is the stabilization inside of the body. Now, the best way to test this is to just sort of walk with the camera in video mode. And straight from these shots, if we review them, I feel that the R3 and the R5 is probably the best when we compare it to the R6. Which is kind of funny because on a piece of paper, on a spec piece of paper, its spec says it's 8 stops, 8 stops, 8 stops.
Yes.
But there is something different here that just makes it look a little bit more stable. Maybe there's some digital magic happening in the background, we're not sure. But from what we could see, I think the R3 and the R5 stabilization is a little bit better. Now, our next segment, we're going to focus on some of the video differences with these little machines. Now, first up, I'm going to start off with some of the slow-mo capabilities as we were shooting mountain biking with Skulk doing his thing on the pump track. But I first need to say that these files are baked in at slow-mo. So if you shoot in slow-mo, it will play back already slowed down. And that's the same when you do it on your computer. So you have very little control over the frames, but it's still cool that you do have these high-speed slow-mo features in these cameras. So R5, it's 4K 120. R3, 4K 120 as well. However, the R6, you can only shoot in 120 frames per second in full HD. Now, I think you'll hit us up with some of the more higher end resolutions and what can do RAW or not.
Yeah, so basically, if you're running through these units, your R5 is billed as the more video-centric option within this range. And that unit is going to give you the ability to record internal 8K RAW at a maximum of 30 frames per second. Your R3 over here will shoot 6K RAW, and that'll be capable of doing it at up to 60 frames a second, which is very, very handy. Your R6, though, does not shoot in a native RAW format, unfortunately. Now, with all of these units, you can output an uncompressed file to an external recorder. In these two units, obviously, that will allow you to do a higher resolution output than what you can do on the R6, but still very, very handy that you can still feed a nice uncompressed feed out via your HDMI port on them. Now, the one thing that I do want to touch on at this moment is, yes, we were filming outside, and it was rather hot.
Yep.
Okay. And the R5 kind of had a little moment there.
Yeah, we were shooting on a tar pump track, so we kind of put the camera down on the tar a little bit.
We might have, yes.
Yeah. And then next moment we picked it up and we saw a little warning message on the menu, right?
Yes, and unfortunately the R5 did overheat at that stage. And we know that this is something that happens on the R5 units, and yes, it has been vastly improved with firmware updates and that kind of thing in the past. But if you are going to be shooting a lot of the 4K 120, the 8K, the R5 is going to struggle a little bit. The other two units, no issues whatsoever, but unfortunately, it is something that you have to keep in mind. Now, after spending a lot of time shooting with these cameras, specifically the R6, the R5, because they've been out the longest and we've shot with them tons, and then the R3 coming in a little bit later in the range, and we're still kind of getting used to the R3. A lot of things are quite apparent here. Your R6 would be the ideal camera for somebody starting out shooting sport, wildlife, getting into it. Maybe not doing it as a profession, but doing it as quite a serious hobby.
Yeah.
That's kind of where your R6 would be. Your R5 is the all-rounder. It is the video spec machine. It is the higher megapixel unit. It is arguably the one if you are a working general photographer, you want to shoot weddings on the weekend, you want to do some sport during the week, you want to be able to go out to a wildlife sanctuary and shoot some animals running around and that kind of thing. If you want to do a little bit of everything, R5 would be the way to go. And then your R3 is very dedicated sport and wildlife, and more aimed at a more professional segment in that range than what the R6 would be. But at the end of the day, none of that really matters. What matters here is, where would you spend your money?
Yeah, and I think it comes back to that point, what you made, and that is when you put these cameras side by side on the same day and you shoot with them, you do really kind of feel and see the differences and where the differences lie. Now, as you know, I like mountain biking and I shoot some mountain biking every now and then. And when you're shooting these guys, especially professionally, there's no second chance. I mean, with Skulk, we could tell him, whoa, just go around the bend again, you know. But when you're shooting professionally, there's no second chances. And that's where the R3 is going to be the winner for sure. Because the autofocus is so good that you will never miss the shot. And I think that is so crucial. And I personally prefer the better battery life. This having double the battery life than these two units.
Yeah.
Yeah, it doesn't shoot 8K. I don't need 8K video. And I think that's why the R3 would probably be my camera of choice. If I could get it, I will definitely go R3. How do you feel? What do you think is the camera that you would like in your bag?
I almost want to say that I would be perfectly happy going R6 or R5, because both is very, very capable of what I like to shoot. The only thing that is going to sway me towards the R5 in this case is the extra megapixels.
Yeah.
The video performance is great and it's a very nice to have. And yes, it is handy. It is good to have that uprated performance. But the megapixel count for me is what's going to draw me in that direction. The ability to, if I need to, crop and reframe a little bit without having to rely on zoom lenses. The ability to get a little bit more contrast out of that sensor than what I can maybe out of the R6. That's going to draw me towards that unit over there.
And that's it for our video today, guys. We hope you enjoyed it, and let us know in the comments below which camera will suit your style of needs better. And remember to hit the like button and also subscribe if you want to see more content like this.
Yeah.
And also go check out the Specialized Pump Track in Stellenbosch. It's a really cool place.
Indeed it is. And guys, until next time, cheers.
Bye-bye.